Okay, our next speaker will take a slightly different approach to this. We met for the first time yesterday and gave me an awful lot to think about, in terms. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Alexi Drew. She is a Senior Analyst in Defence, Security and Infrastructure at RAND in Europe. She has previously held positions at the Policy Institute, King's College London, the Centre for Science and Security Studies at King's, and the Global Network on Extremism and Technology. Her work focuses on emerging technologies, international norms surrounding them, and their impact on international relations and geopolitics. Her topic is pretty much that, is evaluating the state-of-the-art technologies and techniques that will aid effective cyber attribution and lead to deterrence. Alexi, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I thank you for introducing me as the one who perhaps leaves people with more questions than answers. I think that I'm going to try and not do that to too great an extent, and in fact, hopefully give some answers along with the questions. I think it's fair to note that I'm probably the odd one out in the room of presenters today, in the fact that I don't come from a government or security services background. I come from an academic one, and that now works in a private consultancy role around policy. What I'd like to do effectively is to talk through a couple of key different perceptions and perspectives on the purposes, the nature, and the direction of travel around attribution and its connection to the term deterrence that we're discussing, that convocation of two terms. Now, in order to do that, there's first of all, I want to talk about that there are actually different facets with regards to what attribution might look like. There are, I would broadly say, three. There's technical attribution, there's legal attribution, and then there's political attribution. Now, the third of these is the often hardest to interact with and to understand. We've already seen from earlier presentations today the discussion of understanding the intent that might exist within, particularly the aggressors that are outside our organizations, is very hard to do. Influencing that intent can also be difficult. But effectively, that's what we're going to talk about, deterrence as a means to try and achieve. However, what I would also argue that this more opaque component and facet of attribution is increasingly becoming predominant with regards to what attribution actually looks like when it's operationalized, when it happens, particularly when targeting rather than criminal organizations, but state-backed organizations or entities that are carrying out these attacks. And because it's increasingly, well, it always has been, but it's predominantly clearer and clearer that some of these organizations, these criminal ones, have significant connection to state organizations. This political component and facet is becoming increasingly critical in the decision as to whether to attribute and how to attribute. And that also leads us on to the discussion that attribution has fundamentally a number of potentially different, often complementary, but not always complementary goals. These goals can be effectively split into punitive goals, so to punish for a particular act that is seen as breaching a threshold of acceptability. It can be seen as deterrent, designed to try and stop a certain act from happening again and to put off an aggressor or an attacker from carrying out that kind of behavior that is seen as, again, unacceptable. It can be norm setting, a form of attribution designed to try and designed to formulate or support international norms or domestic norms of behavior within, in this case, cyberspace and the use of cyber capabilities, offensive and defensive. And finally, it can be intended to have a signaling purpose. The idea of attribution to effectively communicate a particular position to both aggressors and, in many cases, allies as to what this position of acceptability in fact is. Often, this is seen as a component or a subset of diplomacy, and a lot of these things do become effectively a new form of digital diplomacy that includes attribution of cyber attacks, but also mis and disinformation campaigns and information operations. But these are different goals that are behind the usage, political usage often, of attribution that can often be accompanied by technical and legal ramifications should those combinations of those different facets be designed to have or required to have that extra leverage put behind them in order to achieve the intended goal. Now, the other thing to consider, that attribution is often considered to be something which, historically at least, in international forums, has been the sole remit of state or perhaps international or interstate actors or institutions. We talk about this being the remit of governments or perhaps institutions such as the UN, the EU, etc. In reality, much as is the case with all sorts of things where technology, particularly digital technologies grounded around the internet, come into play, is that we've seen a significant proliferation of the types of actors that are engaging in these different facets of attribution: the technical, the legal, and the political. It's no longer just a remit or the realm of states or state institutions of shared cooperation and collaboration in this activity. We see state actors that are political, the old-fashioned group, taking part in attribution. We see strict criminal organizations that are affiliated either directly or indirectly with states taking part in attribution. We see those international institutions and an increasing plethora of them as more and more get spun up to be more specialized. NATO, for example, developing its centers of excellence in this area, and also the EU spinning out centers like the Hybrid Warfare Center of Excellence. We also see private companies getting involved, and there are broadly actually two subsets within this. Private companies such as the providers of services, Microsoft, Facebook, IBM, etc. Brad Smith, chief executive of Microsoft some time ago, when launching his call for what he called a Cyber Geneva Convention, including around attribution and the discovery and sharing of information, effectively claimed that his reasoning behind this and putting Microsoft in this position was that the war of the future, cyber war as he termed it, was taking place in the back garden of companies like Microsoft on their systems, and so they had to themselves take a far more proactive role. And this has translated into technical attribution in terms of identifying particular means of ingress into systems of malicious activity, and also going so far to take proactive measures punitively or ineffectively to create greater resilience by taking offline particular components of infrastructure used maliciously against Microsoft and its partners and those who use its services. We've also seen private companies of a slightly different ilk developing increasingly greater roles in the political and technical attribution. Groups like Dragos, I mentioned Kaspersky somewhat perhaps contentiously, but is worth doing. But these groups are increasingly taking a role in not just technically attributing these sources and the means of attack, but also then attributing them to political sources, so and intention and interventions by state actors. And this is not a role that the private sector has commonly held in other similar political, international geopolitical spaces. So this is an interesting and quite critical development. We also see research groups, academic and otherwise, being involved, maybe without quite understanding the implications of what they're doing by attributing attacks to certain aggressors, without perhaps complete knowledge or the understanding of what that attribution might do in terms of signaling different intents and potentially escalating ongoing conflict to different levels. And finally, we also see groups of activists, hacktivists, and indeed individuals who, for profit, for ideological reasons, or for simply what they believe to be the right thing to do, attributing technically and politically the sources and means of malicious activity. And this again is further complicating and increasing the complexity of the landscape of political and technical attribution. Now, another thing I kind of want to bring on from this is that there's a number of key trends that this proliferation and the nature of attribution in terms of technical, legal, and political can be seen to be having. One is this there is an undeniable increasing proliferation of cyber attacks against critical national infrastructures, as it's proliferating in two ways: number of attacks and number of attackers. That as the targets increase, as we all become more digitized, as a previous presenter suggested, and is undeniably the case, you increase the attack surface. And as more and more attacks prove to be, at least to an extent, viable and able to provide the outcomes that the aggressors are looking for, more and more potential aggressors are going to appear as they identify new means of achieving political and economic goals through the use of malicious cyber attacks. So we're seeing that increased proliferation, and especially seeing it increase against, at the state level as well, critical national infrastructure, which are a key and potentially highly critical, in the name, target of attack. We're also seeing an increasing encompassment of cyber means effectively as a way of achieving political goals. And by this I mean that cyber is now a key and central part to a lot of military and political doctrine with regards to the nature of conflict and escalation pathways. The US, France, Germany, Russia, China, and the list goes on, have effectively military doctrine and political doctrine that states the usage of cyber and how it fits within their conflict pathways, and when they might use it and when they might not, and the responses they might give to cyber being used against them. It is no longer simply something which is potentially only a tit-for-tat relationship where cyber might lead to cyber through the route of attribution and then deterrence or response. There is distinct likelihood and possibility of a cyber attack leading to a kinetic use of force, or the whole range of potential state-to-state responses to an act of aggression against its infrastructures. The other thing to note is that attribution itself is increasingly leaning towards a collaborative model. It's recognized by many states and international institutions and this diversifying array of actors that attributing alone is not sufficient to have whatever the goal of your attribution might be. That doing it collectively is a far more viable means of actually achieving those goals, be they punitive, deterrent, normative, or signaling, or a combination of those. And increasingly we're seeing attribution regimes, if you like, of shared collaboration around intelligence sharing, along the lines of the Five Eyes Treaty and others, but also in the EU of collective attribution for the goal of deterrence, etc. And the final thing I'll kind of leave this on is that deterrence, we're not quite sure if it works in cyberspace. It's a useful word. It's one that we have dredged, if you like, from a previous history of this kind of theoretical understanding of how geopolitics, international relations works. But the evidence is not clear as to whether deterrence and the models we use to understand it is effective with this new kind of technology, and whether it's understood enough to simply be copy and pasted from the realms of nuclear, biological, chemical deterrence between states. And that does mean that we need to be as forward-thinking as possible in understanding what happens next. And I think I will leave it there and allow any questions to come out in the Q&A.
You gave me so much to think about. I like the technology, the intelligence, the law enforcement, but your perspective is pretty interesting. So thank you for that.
Pleasure, as always.